Welcome to the Human Together podcast, a show that is centered on humanity to create understanding and appreciation for individuals and groups that are both informative and thought-provoking. Today, I explore a topic that has interested me for years, one that has baffled my thoughts as to their existence, one that seems deplorable by today's social understandings, and yet they undeniably existed: Oklahoma Sundown Towns. In this episode, I delve into the history of sundown towns and their existence not just in Oklahoma, but across the nation, and how they served as the visual and historical root of racial hatred towards African Americans and other minorities. It can be said that we must confront our history in order to learn from it. But has society learned from the ills of the former sundown towns? Signs of racial tension still exist with one of the specific towns I focus upon, as evident by the recent news stories of bigotry and racial bias. So how far has society come in terms of race relations? What lesson has history truly taught us? And what are the new visible signs of reconciliation? Let's start by highlighting two recent instances of racism that happened at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. An examination of these incidents are not an indictment of the specific university, which exists in some degree at other universities and towns across America, but rather a reflection of current society. There are certainly good and well-intentioned people and entities at OU and Norman, and these stories of racial injustice may only represent a handful of citizens and students, but they do exist. The first incident occurred in 2015, in which a video went viral of OU fraternity members singing a song containing racial slurs in which African Americans were not allowed to join the fraternity. The university president at the time called the incident reprehensible. He took action by shutting down the fraternity and suspending students who took part in the video. The incident put a microscope on OU across the nation, and not a positive one at that. Did the institution learn and racial incidents cease? I think not. A further reported incident occurred in January of 2019, in which another derogatory video went viral of two students in blackface proclaiming, "I am an N-word." Racism has certainly not gone away, and evidence of institutional racism are still at the forefront. Are these two occurrences isolated incidents or a byproduct of racism that still exists? Certainly, Norman, Oklahoma has made strides over the last 50 years in terms of race relations, but obvious roadblocks still exist that need to be overcome. Dr. Maya Angelou famously quoted, "I have a great respect to the past. If you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going." A reflection on racism and bigotry of the past begins with the investigation of what are called sundown towns, of which Norman, Oklahoma was certainly historically categorized as. Sundown towns were extra-legal or outside the law efforts to exclude African Americans from being in certain towns after dark and becoming a member of that town or city. The known period of Norman being a sundown town was between the years 1889 to 1967. It must be noted that not all Normanites supported these unwritten policies of hatred, and many opposed these atrocities. In Professor James W. Lowen's book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, page 4, he writes, "A sundown town is any organized jurisdiction that for decades kept African Americans or other groups from living in, and this was all white on purpose." Lowen identified over 50 towns in Oklahoma that historically were considered sundown towns, and thousands across America. I offer the following as further evidence. Oklahoma Black Dispatch, February 9, 1922. "A gang of ruffians have disgraced this city again in an attempt to maintain the vicious reputation of the city not to let Negroes stay in the town after sundown. For many years, Norman had signs and inscriptions stuck around in prominent places which read, 'N-word, don't let the sun go down on you in this burg.' Saturday night, when Cindy Smith's orchestra of Fort Worth, Texas, attempted to play in the dance hall, where they were employed by the students of the University of Oklahoma, a mob of outlaws stormed the hall and practically wrecked it. The orchestra was taken to the interurban station and sent to Oklahoma City, where the mob grew in strength, and it became evident that there would soon be trouble. Fights occurred between the mob and students who formed a bodyguard, while the Negroes were escorted to the station. Negroes are occasionally seen on the streets of Norman in the daytime, but the rule that they leave the night is strictly enforced. Several other Oklahoma towns have similar customs. The article is titled, 'Norman Mob After Cindy Smith Jazz.' Dr. Michael Givel, a professor of political science at the University of Oklahoma, previously gave a presentation to the Cleveland County Historical Society titled, 'Sundown on the Prairie, White Ethno-Nationalism and Exclusion of African Americans in Norman, Oklahoma, from 1889 to 1967. I reached out to Dr. Givel to give his insights on Norman as a historically sundown town and what outward signs are needed towards reconciliation.
Welcome to the Human Together podcast show. Can you give me a brief history of Oklahoma Sundown Town?
They were created shortly after Reconstruction in the Civil War, U.S. Civil War. After Reconstruction ended, the the era of African American right came Jim Crow. Throughout the United States and the territory of Oklahoma wasn't a state until 1907, of course, there was significant and severe racial violence. In Oklahoma Territory, there was racial cleansing campaigns going on in the late 19th century. Oklahoma has had, as far as we know, numerous sundown towns, but it's not unique to the United States.
There are other countries that experience this as well?
What I meant by unique is it's not unique as a state to the United States. Now, in the Deep South, this was a racial caste system since the Civil War, after the Reconstruction of the Civil War. Outside the Deep South, every state and every territory in the United States has had sundown towns. And in fact, one researcher estimates that 1890 and the 1950s, there were about 10,000 of them.
Were there written laws, and how was this enforced?
It was a variation of approaches. Mostly it was extra-legal or violent and intimidation tactics. Sometimes it was done through legal means, through zoning or buyouts or freeze-outs. For instance, in the case of Norman, Oklahoma, there was never any legal ordinance. It was done through a variety of different extra-legal campaigns. It varies depending on where you are in the country. A lot of time it was extra-legal. Extra-legal, what I mean by that is that no ordinance was ever passed, so the enforcement of it was done outside of the law.
Primarily through groups like the KKK?
They were prominent, of course, since the second rise of the KKK in 1915 with the birth of the nation, sparking it, according to many historians. First national cross-burning of the KKK occurred later that year at Stone Mountain, Georgia. So they were certainly a terrorist and racist organization that dominated the American landscape, political and cultural landscape, until the late 1920s. Outside of that period, the tactics that were used were often similar to what the KKK would do. It just didn't have the label of the Ku Klux Klan. There was violence before the Klan. There was violence after the Klan. The Klan was simply a very terrifying and a terrorist organization in the United States during that period, 1915 to the late 1920s.
How prevalent was the KKK in Oklahoma, specifically Norman?
The Klan, 1921, 1922, had a massive parade. I mean, when I say massive, there were 7,000 people showed up in a very small town of Norman, Oklahoma, in March of 1922. They had a significant following here. Oklahoma's Klan chapter was one of the most violent and robust of all the states in the United States. One estimate, at least at one time, was that 70,000 white male Protestant Oklahomans were members of the Klan. That's about 1 in 10 of the population.
And it's my understanding KKK actually had a club in the early 1900s at OU?
Yes. In fact, the former vice president of OU, Edwin C. DeBar, was the Grand Dragon of the KKK of Oklahoma. There was a Klan club, in fact, a pretty robust Klan club and presence on the OU campus. There were certainly students that opposed it as well. Campus life goes. And eventually, the Oklahoma Board of Regents removed Edwin C. DeBar due to his Klan activities.
As integration started at the University of Oklahoma during the 50s, how did these unwritten laws affect black students who were living on campus?
Outside of the boundaries of the OU campus, no African American was permitted, due to these extra-legal tactics, to live in the city proper. So on campus, the civil rights movement, which was actually very inspirational, was making headway. The young lady who was the daughter of a minister and an honors student at Langston University applied to the OU Law School, for instance, in 46 or 47, Lois Adel Seipel Fisher, and she was denied simply on the basis of her race. Finally made it to the United States Supreme Court in 49, and the justices heard the case, oral arguments in January. 4 days later, at lightning speed, they issued an injunction to have the University of Oklahoma admit her. There were other efforts as well. In 1949, there was a campaign to basically integrate OU housing. Well, it wasn't really integrated. It was still Jim Crow, and it was segregated. This happened in 1949, so there was segregated Jim Crow housing at OU. So African Americans from that time on, through separate housing, were permitted to live on the campus. Okay, so this was one of the first cracks in the sundown practices in Norman that ended officially in 1967. It was very dangerous for African American students to be in the city of Norman after dark. That's what sundown towns are all about, that something physically is going to happen to you if you're around after the sun goes down. These were very brave individuals who also wanted a university education at OU.
You mentioned this earlier. Not everyone in Norman was for the Sundown Town's extra legal enforcement. Can you explain some of the resistance efforts towards these unjust actions?
Yeah, it's important to note first the context of this. At no time from 1889 to 1967 did the city government officially move with an ordinance to oppose sundown town practices. So this was a well-known practice that had the nod of the political establishment, the economic establishment in Norman, and so forth. Now, during this period, depending on what was going on, there were resistors. And so in the 1890s, a white contractor and an African-American employee, Frank Rogan and J.J. Wallace was the contractor. He was actually called a tinner. We would call it a roofing contractor today. Came into Norman and were doing a tinning job on one of the businesses along Main Street in Norman, and a white mob of around 25 individuals gathered, and they severely injured J.J. Wallace. A bottle was thrown at him, and he lost his left eye. They ran Frank Rogan out, and Wallace sued. And this went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. It's actually, you can Google it. It's called J.J. Wallace versus Town of Norman if you want to read more about it, for damages and for conspiracy to keep African Americans out of Norman. So this is one early legal effort that happened. In the 1930s, a student coalition with the YMCA and some local churches, including the First Baptist Church of Norman, interestingly enough, had formed a coalition late 30s, early 40s to oppose Norman's practice of not allowing African American laborers to be able to work in Norman. This campaign eventually ran its course and unfortunately never was victorious, but was certainly one of the key efforts. And of course, there's the civil rights movement that we were just talking about on the OU campus. And then in 1967, Dr. George Henderson and Barbara Henderson, his wife, he was hired as an assistant professor here. There was a all-white real estate firm that found a house for him, and the story is quite amazing what they did. He and his wife received significant harassment, police harassment, neighborhood harassment, but they were the ones that cracked the racial barrier in terms of African Americans living inside the city of Norman itself. Eventually, in 1971, there was a Human Rights Commission for a lot of different political maneuvering that came into being. One of the powers that it had was based on the 1968 Housing Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in housing. And so it had FINA power and so forth to enforce fair housing practices in the city of Norman. Barbara Henderson was the first chair of that commission, by the way. So throughout the entire history of Norman, there have been various different efforts and individuals who fought for civil rights and human dignity. Really, the practice of Norman being a white ethnocentric nationalist sundown town ended with the Civil Rights Movement and Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. That's not to say that other manifestations don't trouble us today, like police brutality and so forth.
Did Dr. Henderson remain in Norman for a lengthy time?
Yeah, he's still here. He still lives here. He's retired. He's a professor emeritus. He went on to have a very distinguished career.
You gave a presentation about the Sundown Towns, and part of this, you offer some of your policy and recommendations towards reconciliation. Can you share some of those with us?
First of all, local governments should apologize. It should come as an official government apology. This has happened in some places in the United States already. Pocosi, Florida, which was in the central part of Florida, officially apologized for actually a pogrom. African Americans were murdered in that city a long, long time ago, early 20th century. That's number one. Number two, some sort of official updating, but not erasing of the history. And it's interesting how sometimes the rhetoric of this gets into, well, you're going to erase history. Actually, what needs to be done is history needs to be updated and corrected to expand the record, to show what the role of racial injustice justice was, people that resisted it, and so on. And so some sort of a historical park, a unity park, permanent place in a local museum or historical society is crucial to this. And I'm pleased to say that the Cleveland County Historical Society, on its webpage, does have overview and history of Norman Sundown Town. So this is exactly what should be happening. Also of consideration is reparations. That's much more controversial, of course, but it's being raised in Congress and elsewhere, and vigorous enforcement of fair housing laws. Unfortunately, the ugly reality of segregation and discrimination has not gone away, even though there are federal laws that prohibit it.
You mentioned as your first recommendation, a formal apology. Perhaps that some of these people are not still alive. What would be that form, and who would the apology be to, and who would be making it?
It would be made by the government, probably the mayor or the city council, make that apology. It would, as in the case of Cosi, basically outline what had happened, be honest and truthful about what the actual events were. And in the case of Cosi, it went on to say that we will never do this again. We're now a sunrise city, and justice is what we are all about.
You also mentioned there still continues some lingering discrimination in the fair housing. Specifically in Norman and OU, have you seen any other continued racial discrimination?
There's been several incidents that have had wide publicity. Other things are much quiet. But of course, we've had the incident of students with blackface on campus, which major firestorm this past year at OU, the SAE fraternity chant. There has been a situation where an African-American man was mistreated at the Norman Hospital. There are incidents, if you look at the statistics, disparate treatment by police. This is well known, and particularly in places like Tulsa, but Norman, and so forth. And it happens all over the country. While we're no longer a white separatist enclave, which is what Norman was about 1967, other manifestations of this, if you look at it from a long-term historical point of view, continue to plague us.
I would think that OU would speak out against this. Would have been either some formal from the university or student organizations as kind of a resistance standing out saying, we're not going to tolerate this. Are there any formalized efforts in that regard?
Yeah, there have been large student demonstrations on campus, a lot of activity on social media like Facebook. The administration has responded and also criticized its efforts, have institutional responses, including education and so forth. This is an ongoing process. I don't think it's settled as of yet.
Lastly, for my listeners who want to find out more about the historical Sundown Towns, where can they find more information, either books or websites?
You can go to the Cleveland County Historical Society and go over to the page addressing African American history, and my PowerPoint presentation is there. There's also an article that was just published, Chronicles of Oklahoma, volume XCVI, entitled Sundown on the Prairie, the Extra-Legal Campaign and Efforts from 1889 to 1967 to exclude African Americans from Norman, Oklahoma. And one can certainly read that. You can probably get a copy of it if you don't subscribe to the Chronicles at a local library. They often have that, or a local historical society.
The focus of this episode to this point is primarily examine the history of sundown towns, and more specifically Norman, Oklahoma, and existing race relations, followed by Dr. Givel's recommendations for reparations. I would like to bring this narrative to the present day to offer insights for the future. Essentially, what further efforts could be made as a response to recent racially charged incidents, and what reconciliations could be made for past historical racial injustices of the past. I reached out to Clarence Hill Jr. Mr. Hill is the founder and lead visionary for the Stronger Together movement. He is the senior pastor of Antioch Community Church with campuses in Norman and Oklahoma City. Clarence's work specializes in addressing difficult social issues and areas of conflict. He facilitates several strategic city collaboratives, forums, conferences, and campaigns. He speaks across the country on the topic of city transformation, racial harmony, leadership, and compassion.
Welcome to the Human Together podcast show. Will you tell me a little bit about your organization called the Stronger Together movement?
Absolutely. The Stronger Together movement is just that. It's a movement more so than a corporation. So what we seek to do is to promote ideas, principles, and to push a certain message. Part of that message is to shift the narrative around our conversation and around the stories that we believe about one another, that we believe has been really fomented through the national media. With the media, they can't always share a whole story. And really, we believe that's where the dinner table is. That's where we have to be intentional. But sometimes a lot of the conversations that we want to have on a public platform, they're subject to a lot of bias, and we get some hard talking points, and we just begin to unfriend one another based on who we voted for. We believe that there's at least 70 to 80% of the population that simply wants to live in a community that's not so divided, and we have an equation that drives our beliefs, which says shared values plus shared vision equals shared victory. For most of our events, we desire for others to mimic our events, do them in their own form, whether they give us credit or not, we don't care. We just want to see things change. And so we always try to have space where people are at tables together and they're sharing their stories. They're answering questions by sharing their own stories and experiences and talking about how different decisions impact them and even discussing their own dreams, visions, and solutions. We've seen a lot of success in doing this because we aim for a couple categories, and that's bringing people together who are of different ethnic groups, which covers everybody, and also bringing together people from different wealth classes. So oftentimes you have two different communities that don't have a lot of relationship, so all they know about one another is what they've heard in the news or what they've heard passed down from their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. And, of course, the further you go back generational line, closer you get to space and time in America where hatred, racism, bigotry, and all those types of things were blatant and they were open and they were part of the laws of this land. We feel like there's a moment in time for us now to rewrite the narrative by allowing people to share space together, and it's seemed to be pretty successful so far.
And you have two conferences?
Yes, we do. So we have a conference in the spring called the Crossing the Bridge Justice Conference, and we abbreviate it now. We call it the Bridge Conference, and we partner with the Oklahoma City County Health Department, and we invite intentionally leaders and influencers, not just community leaders and leaders in the city and government, but even teachers, those who by changing the way they do things can impact a lot of other people. And we also do a neighbors conference. And that one specifically was born out of one of our past bridge conferences because we had a lot of churches that got involved. So we created a conference specifically for those churches called the Neighbors Conference, and it helps equip churches to reach under-resourced communities and reach across cultural lines, giving them language and opportunities to ask questions and to get those who actually work in hard areas or seek to work in these areas of these breaches, to give them a space to share their wins and their failures and then share ideas together.
Sounds like an incredible conference. Where could my listeners go find out more information about this?
So we have two websites. The StrongerTogether.global website, you can reach all of the information about the Bridge Conference and some of our other initiatives like United Voice Oklahoma, our media initiative with all the news stations. But you could also learn about the faith side of it at StrongerTogether.church, and that will lead you to some of our other partner events where we partner in leadership to, again, continue the conversation through unity and celebration.
That will sound amazing. I look forward to attending that myself. I think that's a really great organization and movement that you've got going, and definitely opening up the narrative opens some people's minds and changes some perspectives. So I think that's great.
I want to bring together your thoughts on a subject that we've been covering in this episode, Sundown Towns, the historical racism that has occurred in Norman, Oklahoma, and how we can address the recent incidents that have happened on the University of Oklahoma, and being mindful of all parties involved.
You know, that's a great question. And so I'll combine these answers. You know, in addressing Sundown Town, I live in Norman, Oklahoma right now, and it used to be a sundown town. Edmond, Oklahoma was also a sundown town. Those sundown towns being places where, you know, it was posted outside the city that by sundown, black, or they would use the N-word, were encouraged to leave. Well, of course, the laws have changed those things since then. But to me, it still impacts how we do things. I like to say that a lot of the Sundown Town signs were moved from the outside of the city to the inside of the front door of the home, because we really can see how integrated we are or how open we are to one another based on who's at the dinner table. And so with that idea, I go into this incident that took place at OU. Right after that incident, they did an interview with me, and I was answering this same question. And a lot of people were saying, well, how should these two young ladies who did the blackface, how should they be punished? I think there's a number of things that could be done. Since an incident like this happens, I think we should take opportunity for a couple of things. One, to make sure that we use this opportunity for people's voices to be heard. So I would definitely be gathering the leaders amongst the young people at the college just to talk to them about how it impacted them and to just hear their input on what they would like to see. Also, there's a greater redemptive story that can come out of this. If those young ladies just get punished and thrown off the campus, that's one level. But blacks and minorities, we really understand what it's like to be under harsh penalties in the criminal justice system. I'm not saying them being thrown off campus is just harsh, but what we look for is restorative or redemptive justice. And if there is any opportunity for those young ladies to be in spaces, of course they would have to want to be in spaces where they can learn and understand how their behavior, whether it was out of ignorance, whether it was out of them just maybe they thought it was intentional, but they really didn't get what they were doing, whatever the reason was, if there's some type of space where they could be doing community service or serving alongside those on the campus who don't look like them, who don't come from the same backgrounds, and it could be a learning experience for them, I would be reaching for creative ideas down that road, because if they just get sent somewhere else and they don't change, I don't think that adds to where we want to go in the future of our country.
You really add a forgiving spirit to that, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think there is lessons to learn from that. What reparations or reconciliations can be made to move beyond the historical injustices of the Sundown Towns? What are your thoughts on that?
Can I give you kind of my raw answer? I have two answers on that one. In the context of Oklahoma, which is a state and an area where, in a lot of circles, even mentioning the term race, to some people is the beginning of someone trying to get ready to make an excuse so they can be a victim, so they can get something for free or something like that. And that provokes a side of me that simply says, you know something, I don't want any reparations. What I really want to make sure that we're building bridges and we're making sure that people are being treated equity and just let people be so they can, we will show you that we don't need someone to lead us, and we can lead ourselves, and we can help on a greater scale to contribute to the future of this country. But our history books have not allowed most of our students and those who fill all the decision-making spaces to really respect how much African Americans and other minorities have contributed to society. I start there. But the other side of me, when it comes to just saying reparations, what are reparations, what has been done, I've just begun to dig into this because my other default was just, I don't want to talk about reparations. Who knows if it's ever going to happen. We'll just do our part now, and we'll make a difference for the future. But now I would like to answer it with more intelligence. So here's where my research starts. I want to know, in the history of this country, when reparations have been done and for who and why. And then we can just compare situations objectively. I would also like to know, whether we use the term reparations or not, when did the government use tax money to help people group out of hard situations like farmers or those in the South when they were running into challenges of transitioning out of, going from an agrarian society to an industrial society? What things did the government do to give incentives and help to boost the economy? And now let's compare that to the plight of blacks and the situation they've been in ghettos and from redlining and from not being in the spaces where decisions are made, which are basically spaces where relationships are. So it would be more of an academic decision for me, and I don't have that information at that level right now.
Is that something you're actively researching then?
I started some conversations with some friends, and in my spare time, I'm starting to pull some notes together. But we're gaining so much momentum on shifting the narrative in our city. We've actually are going on probably about 2 years with our United Voice Oklahoma initiative, where all four of our local channels, 4, 5, and 9, the Oklahoma, Tyler Media, and others, are partnering simply to create a healthy dialogue around race that's been going so well. We're pushing a lot of our energies there right now. But in my personal time, I've just done a little bit of study.
Well, you definitely offer some tremendous insights, and I think you're going to open some eyes just in the conversation that we've had today. So I appreciate you taking the time to visit with me today.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you helping this conversation go forward. Simply about making room to see that we can talk about this in a civil way and really look at things objectively so we can make our communities and our nation better together. Like we say, we're stronger together.
It's important to examine the past and learn from it. Historical occurrences like Sundown Towns are not an easy subject to tackle. But as a society, we must learn from our mistakes and correct them for the future. From this point forward, we must create sunshine towns in which everyone is welcome and free to become human together.